The early struggles of transitioning. Oh, there are so many. At the same time, usually, like with everything else, there's a good side and a bad side to it. When you start transitioning, there are so many positives. Of course, the euphoria, the feeling like you're finally moving in the right direction, and just the feeling that you're finally choosing yourself. But with that being said, the negatives and the reality of what sits in front of you is sometimes too much to bear. I'll tell you about my own story. When I started transitioning, although it was the pandemic, I was 6'2", jacked, um, balding pretty badly, facial hair, had no idea how to dress, had no idea how to just exist. And so you feel like there's this unbelievable number of things that sit in front of you. And although that's partially exciting because now you have things to do, you also realize how far the actual end is, even though there is no end. My favorite saying is there is no destination, there is only direction. And as you start walking in that direction, and before I go there, there's three directions: away from who you are, towards the next evolution of who you will be, or who you are, or who you will be. And the third one, which is the worst one, is being stuck. And as you start walking towards yourself, you realize how incredibly difficult the path will be and expensive, especially for me, I found. Um, Surgeries and laser and electrolysis and buying clothes and makeup and all of this stuff that I never had to buy before, even though I probably did buy some of it. So you're on this path and you realize that there are things that you have to do. And one of the biggest problems with it is that, you look in the mirror and you have this mind's eye vision of what you would love to look like and what you would hope to look like. And for a lot of us, especially who transition later in life, you got to miss out on that early childhood as your authentic self. You never got to have it. And that in and of itself is such a hard trauma because I never got to experience those experiences. I never got to go through high school and do all of those things as myself. I had to do it wearing that mask. But aside from the traumas from before, when you're talking about the traumas in front of you, you look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, wow, I am so far away from how I envision my life looking. And when you're in that spot, it's so difficult to motivate yourself to actually take that step because I know for myself, the very first time I went out, I went to a club actually, and my friend had to actually literally pull me across the threshold of my condo. And once I was out there, I was fine. But you realize that you're not where you want to be, and as a result of that, you face your own judgment. But plus, you imagine the judgment of other people. But you have the judgment of other people. And sometimes it's great, and I mean a lot of the times it's not. And so you sit there and you have to force yourself to kind of be uncomfortable and get comfortable being uncomfortable. And in that first little while, the amount of effort that's required to get yourself into that spot. I remember it took me about 2 hours to do my makeup that very first time I went out. And even so, I probably put on 50 different items of clothing trying to find the perfect one that would hide some of my masculine features that gave me dysphoria and accentuate the feminine ones that I liked about myself. And even so, getting out there and being in that place where I faced the judgment and criticism of other people, even if they were my friends who were 100% behind me, couldn't shake the fact that I was nowhere near where I wanted to be. And I think the early stages of transition, there's this really lucky benefit to having a little bit of that gender euphoria, is that you don't actually really get to see yourself in a way. You see the parts of yourself that you want to see, and you're kind of blinded by, I think, some of the pieces that you don't want to see. And that's kind of a nice little thing that can happen. At least that happened for me. I I kind of didn't see myself. I look back now at those early pictures, and I was like, wow, I was so brave. I can't believe after having hair transplant surgery, and I had all those plugs in the front of my head, and like it was like red and splotchy, and I was recovering from some surgeries, and like it was obvious that I was recovering from all of these surgeries, and I somehow still went out and I still did this thing. And sometimes when I would be at home and I would realize, the magnitude of what sat in front of me, I guess. And then there's this really difficult part where we play the comparison game. You know, we look at others around us, people who we can't possibly be like. For example, I'm 47 years old at some point, 2 years into 4 years into my transition, and I'm looking at a 25-year-old cis woman, and I'm like, shit, why can't I look like her, right? Why can't I be 5'10" and 130 pounds? And here I am, 6'2" and 185 pounds. And I guess a lot of that comes down to self love. And obviously, that journey of self love took a pretty long time. I'm not sure if you guys know this, but a few years into my transition, I kind of got to this really depressed state. I had kind of finished transitioning, at least had all of the surgeries that I wanted to, and was living my life for the most part, as myself. But nonetheless, I still didn't have all the things I wanted. I still hadn't found real love. I still hadn't really loved myself. But getting to this place has been incredibly long and at times incredibly difficult. And when I was in that state, when I was about 47, I, again contemplated, a final solution. And I probably never would have done it. I don't think I was ever actually there, but I mean, I think it provided me some solace that I was, I had at least got to be me, um, even though things hadn't exactly worked out the way I wanted to. Little did I know at the time that things would work out 100 times better than I could have ever imagined. Now I'm here living my happiest life, almost 50 years old, engaged to the most beautiful woman in the world, and living every single day to its absolute fullest. And on top of that, I get to help other people um, live their authentic lives. So when you're in the early stages of transition, going back to that little first point, was you realize how long the journey is. And I think that can be so difficult as a person who is, you know, maybe you started transitioning in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, but maybe you started transitioning in your 50s or 60s. And you sit there and you're thinking, I have to do this very difficult stage of my transition for 3, 4, 5 years until I get to that place where I'm, kind of comfortable. And how do you do it? How do you build up the ability to see something through like this, something that is so, you have to do it on the outside, like it's not something you can't go and transition on an island and then come back and get to live your life. It's not the way it works. If someone had asked me 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago, I guess now, if I could snap my fingers and you could be this person, look like this at least, and be living this person, engaged to the same girl, doing all of this stuff, I would have 6 years ago, I would have been like, abso-fucking-lutely. But now I look back and I realize absolutely that would be a terrible idea. Why? because I needed to go through all of those struggles. I needed to have those experiences, good and bad. And what those experiences did was they shaped me and they allowed me to finally become the person that I have spent my entire life waiting to be. And so the struggles, a lot of people see the struggles as a barrier to their transition. They see, how am I supposed to go out when I'm not remotely looking the way I want to look? I'm not remotely in the body that I feel comfortable in. And I say, that is very much part of the transition. Forcing yourself to see that it is actually part of the journey is so much more important in the long run. Because if you see them as things that are barriers, you'll look for shortcuts. You'll look for ways around it. You'll try not to do those uncomfortable things. You'll try not to push yourself into doing the things that you need to do. Kind of going back to this point of transitioning on an island, you have to do it in the real world. You can't stay in your apartment forever pretending. You have to actually put yourself out there, experience life, engage with people as your authentic self, even if that authentic self doesn't look exactly the way you want. But I promise you, not only you will not look exactly the way you want, you won't actually even be able to be the person, because it's one thing to imagine yourself as, this person and see yourself inside your head. And it's a very, very, very different thing to actually live it. I just recently rewatched The Matrix, and one of my favorite lines in that movie is, there is a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And that very much goes to this point, is you can imagine it, you can think about it, you can imagine, you can do all of these things, you can get yourself all dressed up, you can look the part. But if you're not actually living your life as your authentic self, how are you ever going to actually be this person? How are you ever going to know what it's like to actually engage with the world? And the only way to get there is to go through it. Going through it is painful. Going through it is, at times, literally, I felt like I would have rather have been dumped into a pit of poisonous vipers, fire ants, consume me, instead of going outside in that club as a 45-year-old woman when everybody else is 22 years old, cis, and they were all looking at me like, or at least that's what I felt like, they were looking at me like, what is that thing doing here? I guarantee you they weren't thinking that. I actually got a lot of compliments on that day, that first day I went out. But in my mind, that's what I was thinking. So, the early struggles. See these struggles as absolutely part of who you will become. As you go through them, it's like a diamond being crushed under the pressure. You become more and more like the person that you were meant to become. Those struggles, whatever those struggles look like for you, whether it being family rejecting you, whether it being having to go to work and, where people saw you as one way and now they are going to have to get used to this new reality. And, how uncomfortable that's going to feel, how much effort you're going to have to put in to actually get to that next evolution of yourself. But I promise you, every single step, every single struggle, every little joy, all of them worth it as you become the next best version of yourself.